Okay, so let's talk a little bit of Parsha. So we know that in this Parsha, Yaakov is down in Mitzrayim. The Parsha tells us the last Parsha of the book of Bereshis, which is pretty incredible. And the Torah tells us that Vayechi Yaakov Shvas Rishana, that Yaakov lived for 17 years. We know that he lived for much more than 17 years. Now, rabbis tell us that what it means is that these were the best years of his life. These were the years where he really lived. He had had such a difficult life up until now that it was finally at this moment that Yaakov Avinu was able to appreciate and to enjoy life. But he was worried. And what he was worried about was he was worried about the future of his children. One of the things that he was worried about was assimilation. And one of his ways of combating that assimilation was to make sure that his children understood that Eretz Yisrael was their place and not Mitzrayim. And therefore, he told Yosef that he wanted to make sure that Alma tikbareni b'Mitzrayim. So he said to Yosef, as his days drew close and he got sick, and that, by the way, is another interesting thing, that Yaakov was the first person to get sick. He's the first person ever in the Torah to get sick. Up until then, people died when they expired, and they died with what was called the neshika, with the kiss of death, and their souls expired. But here, Yaakov Avinu got sick. And the advantage of Yaakov Avinu getting sick is that a person, before they leave this world, has the opportunity to be able to set their affairs in order and to be able to deal with with the things that they have to deal with before they actually leave this world. And it's as terrible as it is for a person to get sick and die, but it actually is a great advantage. So he calls in Yosef and he says to Yosef, "Swear to me that Al no tikbareni b'Mitzrayim, that don't bury me in Egypt." That was the last place that he wanted to be. But it wasn't just because he didn't want to be buried in Egypt for himself, but he didn't want to be buried in Egypt for his children, because he was afraid that his children would get stuck there. There was a beautiful story of a certain, of a gvira, a very wealthy person, who himself became religious. His children were not religious. And he told the person that was handling his money that he wanted him to buy him a burial place. He lived in America, but he wanted him to buy a burial place on Har HaZeisim, on the Mount of Olives. And he told him, "And I want you to make sure that when you buy me this burial place, that it has a view of the Temple Mount." So after much time, the fellow comes back to him and says, "I bought you, by the way, when you told me to buy you a burial place, I bought you a burial place." He said, "But I couldn't get one with a view of the temple, so I bought one around the side of the mountain. I didn't really think it was going to matter, because at that point, views don't really make a difference." So he said to him, "Fool." He said, "The view wasn't for me. The view was for my children. That when my children would come to visit my grave, they would turn around and they would see the Makam HaMikdash. They would see the place of the temple. And maybe one time when they're there, when they looked over to the temple, maybe that would inspire them." Yaakov Avinu wasn't worried about himself. He wasn't worried about what this meant for him. What Yaakov Avinu was worried about, he was worried about his children. And he wanted to make sure that they didn't make their home and their permanent place in Mitzrayim. Then the Torah tells us that they tell Yosef, "Your father is sick." Vayikach hashnei banav, he takes his two children, and he goes to give them a bracha. And before he gives them a bracha, he starts to tell a story to Yosef. And he says to Yosef, he says, it's really a whole long story. And then he says to him, "Vani bevoy mipadan, mesa lai Rachel." He says, "Your mom died on the way, on the road, and ba'od kivas eretz lavo efrasa, v'ekbar Hashem, and I buried her right there, b'derech Efrat, on the way to Efrat, in Beis Lechem." Said, and I buried her there. Well, why would he tell him this? This was his last moments, so therefore he was getting everything off his chest and saying that, don't really feel so good about the fact that I buried your mom on the road and that she wasn't buried in the family ancestral plot in Ma'aras Machpelah. So I'm asking for you for forgiveness so that I could go to my maker cleansed and feeling good. I'm not sure that Yaakov Avinu felt any guilt about it. He understood that that's where he needed to bury her. Perhaps, as the rabbis explain, that really what Yaakov Avinu was worried about is that he was asking his children to do something for him, and especially asking his son Yosef to do something for him that he didn't do for his mom. And therefore he felt maybe that before he died, he needed to tell him that even though don't do as I do as I say. Even though it wasn't something I did for your mother, but please make sure to bury me in Ma'aras Machpelah. And that's an answer Chazal give. It's a good answer, but I think that there really is much more there. Because why did he decide to tell him this story now? What was the necessity of telling him and confessing to him that he didn't bury his mother in the Ma'aras Machpelah? So I think we have to take a look at the whole story and give a little review of the book of Parshas. That think about Rachel and Leah. What did Rachel have? Rachel had Yaakov's love, but what did she yearn? She yearned children. What did Leah have? Leah had children. And what did Leah yearn? She yearned Yaakov's love. And this tension is highlighted in the story of the Dudaim, in the story of the flowers, that the Dudaim really symbolize the power of fertility. And Rachel wants them. Leah is bitter because Rachel has the love of her husband, so they exchange. Leah gives Rachel the Dudaim, and Rachel gives Leah the night with Yaakov Avinu. Each one of them gives up what they have to get what they hope for. But in the end, it doesn't help. Leah conceives, and she has another child. And Rachel doesn't, but she has no love. Rachel still has no children. And this bitterness divides the sisters. And I know that because it divided their children. Because the brothers of Yosef, not just that it divided them from Yosef, but it divided them from each other. The Torah says, "V'hu nar es b'nei Bilav es b'nei Zilpa, neshei aviv, v'yavo Yosef es dibasam." He saw that the boys weren't getting along, that the children of Leah were treating the children of the maidservants, the children of Bilhah and the children of Zilpah in a terrible way. But really what was happening is that they were aligning themselves, Rachel versus Leah, Rachel's children versus Leah's children. Leah including also her maidservant Zilpah. Leah's jealousy of Rachel spills over to her children, and it becomes magnified in the children. And the jealousy of Rachel and Leah seems to grow and to become deeper. When does that jealousy begin to heal? When they put their lives on the line for Binyamin, a son of Rachel. And the minute in 2 weeks ago and last week's Parsha, that they begin to worry about the son of Rachel, that they begin to worry about Binyamin, even though Yaakov loves Rachel more, that wasn't their cheshbon now. Now that wasn't their calculation. They didn't care. Now they needed to do the right thing. And a brother is a brother, and it doesn't make a difference about his mom's relationship with the father. That's not their business. Their business is to care about brotherhood. And when that reconciliation began, so then that's when the struggle between Rachel and Leah comes to a close. The truth is, this is exactly why Yosef did what he did. So many people have a question in the Parsha that in 2 weeks ago's Parsha and last week's Parsha, how could Yosef be so hard-hearted against his brother? We've been talking in Pirkei Avos about hard-heartedness, about how terrible is the midah of being hard-hearted, of being an achzari, of being vicious. We talk about midah stom. We talk about the violence of midah stom. This way that Yosef was dealing with his brothers seemed to be a way that was inappropriate. in a way that was so hard-hearted and so vindictive. But the truth is, what Yosef was doing was that Yosef knew that there was this tension. Yosef understood that what God was saying was that when he gave him the dreams, that all 11 brothers were going to unify together, that they were going to come back together as one, and that they were going to breach that rift that existed between Rachel and Leah. By all bowing down to a child of Rachel, it was all going to come together, and Yosef needed to make that happen. And therefore, Yosef could never reveal himself. Yosef couldn't tell over who he was until the moment that he saw the incredible defense that Yehuda put up and the incredible brotherhood that Yehuda was showing and manifesting. It was at that moment that Yosef knew the dreams had come to fruition. His mission was done. Because at this moment, the rift between Rachel and Leah had ended. All her life, Leah yearned for love, and Rachel yearned for kids. And what they yearned for, they ultimately got. Leah was buried eternally next to Yaakov, and Rachel is known as Mama Rachel. She's the Ima of Klal Yisrael. And that's why Yaakov Avinu said this now. Why he mentions V'ani beboi, when I came from Padan Aram, and he says, I didn't do this to your mother, and I buried her here, and I buried her there. Because at this moment, what was Yaakov going to do? He was going to give a bracha to Ephraim Umenashe. And what was that bracha going to do? That bracha was going to confer them the status of children of Yosef, of children of Yaakov. They were going to be conferred the status of tribes. And they were going to become like the children of Rachel. And with that moment, he wasn't confessing. He wasn't in remorse. He was saying it the way it is. And he turns to Yosef and he said, I didn't bury your mother in Maras Machpelah because your mother is eternally going to be the mother. She's going to get her desire of her life. She's going to be the mother of Klal Yisrael. She's going to be the one who's going to cry for them when they go into exile. She's going to be the one that God is going to say, Mini kailech mi bechi, stop crying, wipe away the tears. You have nothing to worry about. V'shavu banim legvulam. Your children are coming home again. Your children. Every member of Klal Yisrael is your child. And I'm going to give her the gift of 2 more children. I'm going to take Ephraim and Menashe, and I'm going to make them like the tribes, like the children. And therefore Rachel has not 2, but Rachel has 4 children. And to Leah, with that he was declaring, when he tells him, Al natik bereni b'Mitzrayim, don't bury me in Egypt, but bury me in the place of my ancestors. Bury me in Ma'aras Machpelah along with Leah, because Leah will get what she desired also. Leah will get my eternal love, and that the 2 of us will be for eternity together. Yaakov Avinu wasn't saying, Chatasi, please forgive me for not burying your mom there. Yaakov Avinu was explaining how it all works and leaving the book of Parshas with the understanding that what they pined away for, though in their lifetime they didn't get what it was that they so sorely desired, but that eventually it all came right. What an amazing understanding of the psukim and an understanding really of just the way the whole thing worked. But I think that the lesson is incredible because there is always a huge gap between what we have and what we want. The Talmud tells us that there isn't a person in the world that dies fulfilling every one of the wishes of their life, of getting everything that they desired. But we know many people, and even for some of us ourselves, that we come to certain places in our life and we say, if I left the world now, I would be a happy person. Because I know that I accomplished things. I know that I did things. I look at my children. I look at my grandchildren. I look at my life. But at the end of the day, we know that there are things that we wanted to do. There are things we dreamed about. And I'm not even talking about an empty bucket list. I'm talking about things that are valuable and real, but we just weren't able to accomplish them. But what we did was we focused on the things that we had and not on the things that we had not. And that when we focus on the things that we don't have, so then our eyes are red with tears, like Leah, rather than filled with a sense of joy and happiness, that even though she doesn't have all that she desired, but Leah, Rachel, had whatever it was what made her feel that she had accomplished something in her lifetime. Look at the way the book of Parshas begins. The book of Parshas begins with Adam Arishon, who focused on what he didn't have, as opposed to focusing on what he had. And that's why Adam Arishon saw the tree, which God said to him, don't eat from, which represented everything and really was the only thing in the world that he couldn't have. It was the only thing that God said, don't eat from this. Enjoy the garden, have everything in the garden, but don't eat from this tree. And Adam Rishon couldn't live with that. He couldn't live with knowing there was something in the world that was prohibited to him, something was out of his realm. And therefore he desired that, and it just took over his life. Because Adam Rishon focused on what he didn't have as opposed to focusing on what he had. And the Sefer Parshas ends. It ends with the understanding that in the end, it's all going to be amazing. In the end, whatever we accomplished is going to be awesome, and it is going to bear incredible fruit. Don't focus on what it is you haven't accomplished. Focus on what you have. Mini koilech mi bechi. Stop crying. Wipe away the tears. Because know at the end, v'shavu banim ligvulam, everything is going to be amazing. And the Sefer Parshas, called the Sefer HaYashar, it's the straight book. There's one straight line through it. And the straight line is that when you focus on what you have, life is amazing. And when you focus on what you don't have, then you will feel like you have nothing. And like Leah, you will live life with this incredible disappointment. And with Rachel, you will be happy with the blessings that you've received. My thoughts, I think a beautiful way to end Sefer Parshas, a powerful way to end. I will give you, since I have a few minutes, I'll give you one other, usually I do one a week, but I'll give you one other also amazing thought on a very specific point in the Parsha, that we know that Yaakov Avinu dies and they bring him to burial. When they bring him to burial, so the Medrash tells us most of this, that there was a delay in the burial process. And the reason there was a delay in the burial process, when they got to Maras Machpelah, who was there to greet them? None other than...
Manny, what if I don't go with you?
None other than Esav. Esav was standing and waiting for them. Now imagine, it's Esav's brother that they're going to bury. And Esav says, what are you guys doing? This is the second funeral Esav is messing up. And they say, well, we're coming here to bury your brother. Oh, can you show me the deed? You want to bury him in Maras Machpelah? Can you show me the deed that is yours? Can you make a movie out of this? Can you play this through your mind? That there's anything rational? I mean, who would you choose to play Esav? I mean, it's such an incredible thing. They've coming, all of his nephews that he hadn't seen for many, many years, all of his nephews are there. And he says to them, show me a deed. So the nephews fall into the trap. And they say, the deed's in Mitzrayim. Okay, I'll wait. So they said, we'll send the fastest, Naphtali. We'll send him back to Mitzrayim, and he'll come back with the deed. In the meantime, the sun is burning, the mace is rotting in the sun, and this is just an abnormal, absurd thing that's going on. So rabbis tell us that Yaakov had a grandson. One of his children, Don, had a son by the name of Chushim. Chushim, as per his name, was deaf. And he turned to somebody and said, what's going on? What's going on? Why are we burying Zaidi? What's going on? Said, they couldn't answer him because he couldn't hear. He had no idea what was the holdup. All he saw was Esav with his chest puffed out and his hands crossed across it, standing there in front of Maras Machpelah, not letting them go in. He takes a sword, he walks over to Esav, and he cuts off his head. Esav's head, according to the Medrash, rolls into Maras Machpelah. So when you talk about what's buried in Maras Machpelah, it's Adam and Chava, Avraham and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah, and Esav's head. Now, as abnormal as that sounds, there actually is an important lesson in that also, which is not where I wanted to go with this, but a very important lesson. Esav's head was filled with Kedusha. Esav's head understood God, but Esav couldn't translate that into his body. There are many people that intellectually understand that there's a God, there is a truth to the world, but that they have no strength to be able to take that truth and to turn that truth into a lifestyle, into a way of existence. Think of all of those scholars of the past that couldn't translate their scholarship and knowledge into practical service of God. That's a whole other story. But what's the lesson of Chushim? Lesson is that a person can get used to anything. The children of Yaakov were having this conversation with Esav, an absurd conversation. Get out of the way, you bulvan! We got to go bury our father. What was the shiloh? What were they talking about? What were they sitting there having a conversation with him? Because you can get used to anything, and sometimes we have to be deaf to things. Sometimes we just can't hear them. We have to know what the emes is, what the truth is, and just pursue that truth and not worry about the things that are confronting us. Ignore them, push them to the side. Don't let them grab onto us, because otherwise we get used to anything. Every one of us knows things that when we were growing up were unacceptable. And by the way, I talk about not one thing, thousands of things that were unacceptable to us. I remember I saw once an article in the 1950s. What was the greatest problem plaguing a teacher in a classroom in public school? Students chewing gum. Today, students shooting the teacher. How the world has changed, and we engage in conversation about it, as if maybe there is some side of normalcy to some of this. Because the longer we listen to it, the longer we let it go into our ears, then the greater of an effect it has on us, and we can accept the most outlandish and outrageous things as truths. Chushim ben Don showed us that sometimes you got to be deaf. Sometimes you can't listen to the stuff around you. You can't engage in conversation with it. Because when you do, it tends to become normal. And that's where the danger lies. Just interesting little point to end with. I wish everybody a very, very beautiful Shabbos.